Okay. Thank you everyone for joining us in preliminary round 5 of the online WSDC tournament 2020. We would like to introduce Team Singapore who are on proposition and Team Philippines who are on opposition. I'm Vanel Goh and I will be your chairperson.
And I'm Ashley Wayne. I'll be your timekeeper for this round.
Let us welcome our esteemed panel of judges, our chair judge, Chaitanya Kadiel, and other judges, Amira Moore, Nick Zavudi, Sophie Macklin. The motion for this round reads, this House prefers a world where all land was held in government trust and leased out on limited term contracts. We will now ask proposition to introduce themselves in the order in which they will be speaking in, and this will double up as a technical check.
Hi, I'm first proposition, Kenneth Poe.
Hello, I'm Gareth, second proposition in reply.
Hi, I'm Bharath. I'll be doing third prop.
Thank you. May we now have opposition to introduce themselves and do their tech check.
I don't know if you can hear us, but David will be first.
I'm David Bloom, first opposition. My bad.
I'm Kirtana. I'm second in reply.
I'm Jake. I'm gonna be third.
Thank you, everyone. Observers, coaches, and team managers are reminded to keep their microphones and videos off at all times during this debate round. Judges, may I confirm that you are ready for the match to begin? Okay, may we now have the first speaker from the proposition to begin?
I just wanted to, because this happened in the round Loco was mentioning in the round I was in, could teams just agree on how they want to do POIs right now so that it doesn't get confusing when the round happens? So is are both teams fine with POIs being both verbal or paper? Would teams just prefer to be verbal? Would teams just prefer paper?
We will be fine with both together, so verbal and paper.
For us, verbal POS are fine. Just don't make it too loud, please, because the judges won't be able to hear.
On my computer, it tends to lag out when I'm speaking, so I might not be able to hear her. So if you notice that I'm not responding to your POIs, just shout louder, I guess, if that's possible. Thanks.
Okay, may we now have the first speaker from the proposition to begin the debate?
Okay, can I be heard? For too long, governments have tinkered on the edges of property. They thought, why not regulate it? But yet regulatory bodies were captured by the landed gentry. They tried zoning and eminent domain laws, but the former gave owners huge discretion, while the latter saw governments fork out above market rate prices for land. It is time we regain control through limited term contracts. Land is a crucial economic asset, allowing people to earn an income such as through agriculture, production, or provision of government services like public housing and hospitals. Hence, the metric for this debate should be how we best utilize this scarce resource. In status quo, there is an unjust distribution of land, where for historical factors like the monarchy in Britain, slavery in America, and apartheid in South Africa, land is held by the wealthy elite. In America and South Africa, Black individuals still own a vanishing minority of land, while in Britain, 3 families with links to the monarchy own over a third of the land in central London. Stance: 1, we prefer a world where all land was held by the government and leased on limited term contracts. This is not a policy debate. Thus, this is not about the process of seizing back land, but rather two counterfactuals. In ours, the government already owns and leases all land, but in opposition, they must defend the status quo of largely private ownership and cannot propose a counter-model. Two, to be clear, we acknowledge value in privately held land, but perpetually held land is problematic. Thus, governments will set an expiration date for land at the end of one generation. This can range from 50 to 90 years and vary between nations and type of land. Three, at the end of that period, the land will be returned to the government. The government can decide to lease the back the land to the previous owner, put the lease onto the open market, or repurpose it for public use. This decision will be made through consulting city planners and citizenry in the area. This is similar. Governments already control essential assets, such as Norway's government controlling natural gas, United States over mineral rights, and national parks. My case will prove how we can better develop land through one, how we solve government need for land, two, how we improve private land use, and three, my second speaker will show how perpetual land ownership on opposition fuels speculation that wastes otherwise productive land. First argument, we solve the government need for land. Premise, governments have a frequent need for land, be it for public services, to reserve as state land, or to sell to generate much needed revenue. Crucially, this comes at a time where the need for land is mounting due to climate change and booming populations in the developing world. When land is held in perpetuity by private owners, governments have insufficient land. Three structural reasons. One, in the early phases of development, governments sold off large swaths of prime real estate for a steep discount to corporations and the wealthy, meaning governments now are unlikely to hold on to sufficient land in their reserves. Two, if they try to acquire land from the open market, they are forced to bid higher prices to snap up the land. They face the same problem if they try to use eminent domain laws, because this contravention of private property rights often requires governments to pay above market rates for land. Three, the idea of governments just seizing land from the rich without paying for it will be met with strong opposition from the very lobby groups that funded the campaigns of the incumbent government. Hence, it's unlikely to be an alternative that governments will ever support in opposition. So this leaves opposition with two realistic options. One, the government forgoes critical public services like affordable housing, schools, and hospitals, as they cannot be built without land. We have seen this in Hong Kong, where a major housing crisis means the average home costs a family 21 times their annual income. This is because developers effectively control housing supply when the government holds on to insufficient land. Hold on a moment to build affordable public housing. Yes.
In Hong Kong, 100% of the land is literally owned by the government. This housing crisis is a result of the government's inefficiency in allocating land.
This is not true. In Hong Kong, more than 70% of the land is in the hands of the top 4 developers in Hong Kong who reserve this land and hoard it, only selling small parcels at a time to drive up the price of housing. This is something I'll elaborate later on in my argument. The second alternative the opposition is left with is the government seizes land. But instead of from the rich, they do it from those who offer them the least resistance. Nature reserves are clear. Indigenous groups and squatters with no documentation are forced out of their homes. This is what happened in Brazil, where part of the push to commercialize more land saw parts of the Amazon rainforest cleared and slums in Rio forcefully torn down, leaving thousands of families homeless. Our solution is for the government to lease out the land in a staggered manner. This affords greater control through 2 key mechanisms. One, there's a regular supply of land for critical users, such as building new schools, hospitals, or to sell for revenue. Two, we ensure a consistent supply of land that allows governments to do proper land use planning, as they can alter land use to suit changing needs, such as allocating more land to public housing when there is a lack of it. No, thank you. Second argument, we improve private land use. The problem with status quo and opposition is that land is wasted in the hands of the landed gentry. When land can be held in perpetuity, custodians of the land lack the ability and incentive to properly develop it. Firstly, ability. Perpetual land ownership means it can be passed down through inheritance into the hands of descendants who are not the most competent custodians, especially when land was already arbitrarily awarded by fortune rather than merit to begin with. They may build up the land to some extent, but never to the maximal point. Two, incentive. Perpetual land ownership incentivizes hoarding because that allows groups to build up economic power. One example is how property developers, in the very example of Hong Kong, typically sell small parcels of built land at any time so that they can collectively restrict the supply of housing to drive prices up. With a land lease instead, landowners are able and incentivized to develop it properly. One, ability. Governments can hold open tenders every time a new lease ends and consider various proposals on how the land is used, choosing those who have the best use for it to award the land lease to. Furthermore, without perpetual land ownership, we avoid poor land use as there is no passing down through inheritance or hoarding. Two, incentive. Current leaseholders are incentivized to properly develop the land so that the government will award it to them again in the next cycle. But why is it that we trust governments more to manage land use? One, in most governments, they face checks and balances, such as by the vote and citizen activism, forcing them to act in the interest of societal welfare. But two, we're not saying that governments are perfect. We are saying that they have far better incentives than short-termist, profit-driven corporations. So if opposition wants to claim that governments are bad or governments may be short-sighted in some way, they need to prove why the wealthy elite would be far better and act in the interest of society, even though historically they have never done so. Uniquely, opposition cannot commit to land reforms on their side for two key systemic reasons. One, perpetually owned land confers political power to the landed gentry because they act as gatekeepers. They control employment, they control supply. Therefore, they can compel governments to act in their interest, such as by blocking land reform or lobbying with their wealth to prevent governments from supporting it. Two, the key difference between a lease and perpetual ownership is the amount of control the government has. So the greater the amount of restrictions by opposition, the closer they move to a policy of land lease. Opposition has to support giving owners a large amount of autonomy. I challenge first proposition, therefore, to tell us how they'll get the much needed land that governments need and how they'll ensure the wealthy elite acts in the interest of the people. Because perpetual land ownership perpetuates inequality and underdevelopment, we propose.
Sorry, I just need to adjust my camera.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 18 seconds.
May we now have the first speaker from the opposition to begin the debate?
Am I clearly loud? Yeah? Okay. In Singapore, 31,000 government flats lie unoccupied. In China, entire ghost towns pollute the countryside, taking away land that could have been used for industry, that could have been used for agriculture. Singapore only owns 80% of government land. We say that if they were to own 100% of government land, which is what they have to support, the government's incentives would have been far worse, because absolute power corrupts absolutely. Let's be very sharp about the burdens in this debate. Team Singapore has to defend 100% of government land usage. What's our stance? We support, in status quo, governments already own a fair amount of land, but the majority of land is privately owned. This is important because it places two burdens on Team Singapore. First, they need to show why the government needs 100% of the land in order to be able to achieve any of their benefits. Quite intuitively, not 100% of land is residential, not 100% of land needs to be built for hospitals, so we can probably get that benefit on our side because the government already owns fair amounts of land. But second, they need to show that the benefits of owning 100% of land are worth trading off the massive economic and social benefits of private property. What sort of property is state-owned in status quo? I think it's probably specific natural resources like some mines or national parks. It's areas in metropolitan or rural areas. So that provide public services or hospitals. It's also some agricultural land. The minority of land is privately owned. We support this. I'm going to forward two arguments in the speech, but first I'd like to respond to the case of Team Singapore. The first thing that I'd like to respond to is their policy. And the first thing I want to point out is that they don't have the fiat to have a policy, because this House prefers. They have the fiat to say that the government will own this land. They don't have the fiat to say how it will be implemented. So they needed to logically justify, and they did not at all, why it would be once in a generation, given the context of lobbying. I think there's two reasons why it won't be. First, it's likely to be short-term leases, like 5 to 25 years, because one, governments operate on short-term election cycles, like that's the terms of their elections. They want to be able to change who owns the land in order to meet electoral demands and serve their people. But second of all, because the shorter the leases are, the more the government has leverage over companies. Hold leverage over them if the companies want to do things like be kicked out, or if the government wants to do things like kick the companies out or force them to meet demands so that they can renew the lease. Second, let's talk about their argument. I think it's so funny that they use Hong Kong as an example in a prepped motion when a simple Google search would reveal that this is an area where 100% of people own the land. They say 4 developers monopolize the land. Yes, because the state only grants leases to those 4 developers because, as they told you in their argument, the third structural reason was lobbying groups. That is symmetric. They don't have the fiat to get rid of lobbying, so Hong Kong is exactly what they have to bear, where elite people can capture the government and then the government allocates land in that way. So cage homes was their problem. But we say that eminent domain isn't as bad as they say. It was an assertion that eminent domain doesn't work, right? The reason why it does is because the fair market value of land is what is used to calculate eminent domain and how much the government has to pay. The reason why this is important is because fair market value is used to also calculate the property income tax burden that somebody has to pay. So when you self-report your property and you don't fair value of your land, you have an incentive to report that on the lower end of the spectrum because you don't want to pay high property taxes. Conclusion, governments can probably reasonably acquire private land if they really want to. Finally, as to the point of hoarding, obviously, if you can't use that land productively, you're losing massive amounts of potential revenue. So you're likely to hire somebody else who can, like get an investor to come in and do that. You don't have to do it yourself. You can hire a company to do that for you, or just sell the land to somebody who can. 2 arguments in this speech. First, why does giving government ownership over all land create perverse incentives to misallocate? We agree that governments have good incentives in status quo, but that when land owning becomes a privilege, not a right that the government can grant to individuals, the government becomes far less accountable and allocates land far worse, for 3 layers. First, because access to land depends on the goodwill of the government. In proposition, the government has absolute discretion to allocate land. They concede this for 2 reasons. First, leases expire automatically, so there's one chance, and the government has the automatic ability to revert back to that land ownership, so the government can automatically allocate it to its discretion. But second, you need to apply for government permission to renew a lease. Therefore, that means that the government automatically gets the land and there's automatic ability for the government to control the land. In status quo, because of property rights, if the government wants to take land, it has to justify why this is genuinely in the public interest. And the reason why this is important is because private owners have an incentive to challenge you in things like the courts and in the court of public opinion. So the government is forced to justify why it has a public interest in being able to actually take that land. So it only takes it when it really needs it. Moreover, I think it's harder to scrutinize when the state owns 100% of the millions of kilometers within the land, as opposed to the limited government land ownership that it has right now. Because of this, the government on prop doesn't have to justify how they allocate land because it's just the norm. So they have far less accountability about how they allocate land on their side of the house. Yes?
If your claim is that governments will give in to short-term election demands, then why is it that they would just pay a below market rate or fair market price for eminent domain when the electorate will expect that they pay an above price for contravening on their private property rights?
I don't understand. Why would the vast majority of the electorate want the government to pay high prices to rich people so that their public housing is more expensive? It just doesn't make sense. So second layer, ability of the public to compare privately owned land to publicly owned land. In status quo, since most land is privately held, if the government wants to maintain its use of its land, it has to use that land productively because people can viscerally compare that to the way in which the private sector is productively using land to do things like build malls and build skyscrapers. In proposition, if the land is generally poorly managed, you have absolutely nothing to compare it to because you didn't know a more efficient system where it existed. So there's far less protests on their side of the house, far less people willing to speak out against the government, far less accountability. But third layer, this is devastating for their case. Governments have the ability to crush dissent on their side of the house. Because land, as we agree, is the basis of the majority of economic and social activity within the state. You need it for shelter, for the ability to have industry, the ability to run a media company. We think that granting the government the ability to own all land and making it a privilege that the government is free to grant means that the government has the ability to crush down and take away no more points the land and the economic rights of literally anybody within the state who speaks out and dissents. In the Philippines, the government had the discretion to grant media licenses, so it took it away from ABS-CBN, which is a news company, to crush dissent. In proposition, this chilling effect applies to every newspaper, to every protester, because if you speak out against the government, they will take away your lease or it will not be renewed. The company will be forced to go under or will forced to go to a suboptimal location. Governments want to do this because most governments tend to have a party in power that is dominant at some point, and they have the incentive to maintain power and crush dissent. On our side, people are more secure with their property. They can speak out against the government. Impact. On the comparative, the government is less accountable on their side of the house since people don't know or they're too afraid to call the government out, which means more corruption of that land and more government sending that land to cronies or elites who can afford to be corrupt because nobody will call them out. It means more of governments allocating land towards firms which lobbied for their re-election campaigns and a less efficient economic allocation of land and less things like public housing that they would want. This is the metric that Team Singapore took on themselves. They wanted to prove that the land allocation would be better on their side of the house. We say it is far worse, and we can claim all their benefits because the limited amount of land that the government owns now is sufficient. Second argument, why private sector ownership of some land is necessary for economic growth. We think that this has massive economic and social benefits, even if the government has the best incentives. Why do free markets generally allocate land in the way which it is most productive? The reason is because if you are somebody who wants to buy land, the only reason why you would be willing to buy that land is if the value of that land to you personally was greater than the price that you paid for it. And because companies which are profit incentivized would only ever put a value on land if they can make a profit from it, they would only ever be willing to pay for land if they think that they can make a greater profit for it than the person who's currently occupying that land. So therefore, it means that under a system of private property, land naturally flows from where it is least productive to where it is the most productive. On the flip side, the government can't possibly scrutinize millions of kilometers of land deals and make the optimal decision, even if it really wanted to. We have more economic growth, we have a more accountable government because we recognize that absolute power corrupts absolutely. Opposition.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 15 seconds.
May we now have the second speaker from the proposition to begin the debate?
Can everyone hear me? I'll just speak at this volume. If you have a POI, just shout it out. I think it's interesting that side opposition uses Singapore as a big harm to publicly owned leases. The 31,000 homes that he talks about being empty aren't actually empty. These homes are pre-built because of population planning to ensure that everyone in Singapore, when they have a family, has a home. It's for this reason that Singapore has some of the lowest rates of homelessness in the world. So we thank side opposition for that example. But the use of Singapore as a reason as to why the public ability to seize land on our side of the house using land leases as an important way to ensure that public goods are built for individuals who need them the most. I want to talk about two things. First, I want to discuss the government capacity to manage land. And second, I want to engage them directly on their comparative. Explain to you why their comparative is not the free market haven that SIRS opposition wants to talk about. But first, let's talk about the government ability to manage land. Now, the main claim that we get from side opposition is that they have an alternative of eminent domain and some seizure of government land. I have a number of responses to this. One, the problem with running a country is that your needs are ever changing. So you don't just need to take over a certain amount of land, but because of the way that cities develop, the land that you need is going to be constantly changing depending on the economic situation of your nation. The side opposition seems to have a lot more faith in governments than we do.
Point of information.
Because cities evolve differently, there are different leases with different lengths that they can use to adjust their policy. In their world, starting at year 0, governments must get the right amount of land exactly in order for them to figure out which one they need to take. Second, this means that they are stuck in a dilemma. Either governments come in and seize land extremely regularly, in which case all of the harms of eminent domain, all of the harms on businesses, all of the harms they apply to our side become worse at the point in which governments become a lot more unpredictable, at the point in which governments now have to pay much higher prices for eminent domain. The reason why they have to pay these high prices is because of another piece of analysis they keep out. And here, let's do the comparative on government accountability. In our world, the government is held accountable by democratic checks and balances. Now, obviously, there's still going to be some corruption. No country is perfect. But when a land lease is mysteriously given to a minister's cousin in our world, there's a very large democratic backlash against it.
Point of information.
In their world, the minister's cousin has inherited that land from his grandfather and is allowed to use that land without any form of recourse whatsoever. The response that they get is that this land lease is going to have to be short because governments are short-termist. But why?
Point of information.
It's not within the incentive of governments to bring themselves towards economic ruin and shoot themselves in the foot. But it's in their world when they allow the landed gentry to develop capital, to develop power, when lobbying power is comparatively greater in the world of the opposition. The only response that they finally had was, there's a lot of land, guys. How are we going to keep track of all of this land? I don't know. Like, presumably there's quite a lot of land on governments on their side of the house. So first of all, they do in fact trust governments to figure out which land they want to seize under eminent domain as well. But second, at the point in which the government becomes the core person that individuals can look to in terms of this land sale, we think it's much easier for the public to hold governments to account, because not everyone has to look at every single piece of land, but probably key infrastructure and key projects that people can look out to on our side of the house. Look, we are obviously imperfect, but their ability to build capacity, that is to say, for example, bring in consultants and individuals, build up ministries in the civil service in order to decide how this land is most effectively used, is important. It's worth noting that side opposition literally uses the example of shopping malls as their best example of efficient land usage. The comparative of the free market is not one that we ought to be treasuring on our side. But before that, is there a point?
Why would anybody report on the minister's cousin getting a land if the media company is too afraid the government won't renew their lease, if people are afraid that if they protest, their leases will be renewed and they'll be kicked out of their homes?
Well, it's worth noting that the comparative in your world is that the government comes along and takes the ministers, it takes the media companies land using eminent domain. Like, I'm not sure why this comparative is any better on either side of the house. So I'm going to move on to the second question then, on whether or not the free market is a good alternative. So this is where I directly clash with the second argument about how actually the free market is actually rather efficient. The problem with this argument is that he bases this argument in a vacuum where one person sells it to another just because of financial reasons. But that's not true. A lot of the time, the reason as to why people actually own land isn't because they bought it, it's because they inherited it. Like, Kenneth goes to you quite a long amount of time explaining to you the historical reasons as to why 1/3 of prime real estate in London is owned by people connected to the royal family. And why is this important? It means that these people aren't likely to give up their land, maybe because of family connection or whatever reason. But it's worth noting that means that the best people to use this land aren't actually the ones getting it. Instead, it's people who happen to inherit it. Instead, it happens to be individuals who are unlikely to use this
Point of information.
Look, governments already carry out antitrust laws on both sides of the house. Proposition isn't running an anti-free market case. What we are saying is the ossifying of privilege harms the ability of the free market to completely continue its renewal cycle. And we think that when they have it on their side, they drop all of Kenneth's argumentation about the problems with this. They drop Kenneth's argument about public housing. They drop Kenneth's argument about why their alternative for governments is to go after individuals with the least resistance. These are argumentation that they haven't been willingly able to clash with, and all they have ever said to this was, we can do some of it as well. But we've already pointed out to you why that's an insufficient response. I'm now going to move on to my team's third and final argument. I'm going to talk to you about how this
information.
And here, I'm going to clash even further with what side opposition said about how they actually get land to be used effectively. Look, our thesis of this argument is that limited term contracts prevent speculation. Let's ask what speculation is. Speculation occurs when you buy a land purely for the purpose of selling it. And this is because land is a highly tradable asset that can be used for many economic activities. The problem is that when you hold on to this land without using it for extreme periods of time, that leads to inefficiency, because speculators have no incentive to invest in the land that they buy, because one, that creates a sort of path dependency that reduces the amount of individuals they can sell that land to, and second, because it's kind of expensive to invest in land. This means that there are vast swathes of land that individuals are unlikely to use and are likely to be left unoccupied. So they use the example of Hong Kong. It's worth noting that although technically Hong Kong does have leases, it's worth noting that complications with the fact that the British government sold it off directly to a bunch of individuals means that the Hong Kong government has very little control over this land. So we think that the comparative in our world would have been much better if the Hong Kong government had control from the start. But second, this also means that the prices fluctuate a lot. And because of this, this means that the poor and individuals are unable to actually get this land where it's cheapest and most affordable, and they need it the most. Third, this often creates situations of bubbles where housing market crashes often cause entire financial markets to get destroyed. How then do we change this? The first thing that we do is that we disincentivize individuals from holding onto land for extended periods of time. Because if you hold onto land under a government lease for extended periods of time, you get more and more desperate because you realize that you can't reap the benefits of that lease. That means that you have to sell it quickly, or you actually have to use that land effectively in order to recoup losses. What is the significance of this? In Bali, when 60-year leases were implemented to prevent foreigners from coming in and taking over the real estate market, it was this policy that effectively allowed individuals in the local areas of Bali to actually be able to afford housing. So why is that argument important? This argument takes them at their best, explains to you another reason as to why the freehold usage of land creates speculation and funds the inefficient usage of land. We believe that perpetual land ownership perpetuates inequality and poverty. We are proud to propose.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 11 seconds.
May we now have the second speaker from the opposition to begin the debate?
Am I audible? Panel, proposition cannot win this debate on the one example of, it worked in Singapore. Because note that the vast majority of states are not small islands you can go across in one day. The vast majority are not as developed, and the vast majority have a significantly larger population to cater for. I'm going to start with a few clarifications in this debate before moving on to my two contributions. What proposition had to do was engage with the characterization of what the status quo looks like. It is not enough for them to just come up here and say, the state needs land and we can't get it. What they have to do is why there is a necessity to get 100% of land in order to fulfill the need for the state to provide public provisions. They can't just come up here and say, we need a lot more land, therefore we're going to take all of it. They have to justify why it has to be 100% and why the status quo right now is not enough. We think what you do on their side of the house is remove the structural incentives that they care so much about that regulate and hold the state accountable. The incentives of the fact that there's private owners of land that are regulating and comparing to the state's use of the same land. The fact that the public is able to speak out. These are the same structural mechanisms that you remove on their side of the house that do not allow you to ensure that the state's use of this land is actually effective. Note that the analysis coming from my first speaker explained to you that regardless of if the state has good incentives or bad incentives right now, the closer that the state gets to 100% ownership of land, the worse that their incentives become. They had to respond, not just say that that's not true and move on to their argumentation. And I'm honestly not surprised that proposition was so dismissive about the Singapore example when their very battle cry in this debate was about a poor allocation of existing resources. Like the fact that 31,000 homes are just standing there not being used is a poor allocation of resources. These are lands that could have been used, whether it was for private use or commercial use, that would have brought more economic activity if it had been allocated anywhere. Note how that very example does not fulfill the one burden they set up for themselves in this debate. I'm going to start with my responses before moving on to my case. Let's respond to the small principle that we heard for like 1 minute coming out of second proposition. The idea that this land was unjustly acquired. Panel, it's an unfortunate reality that the historical accidents mean that the land that we use right now was probably unjustly acquired. But note that moving ownership of this land from private owners to the state doesn't make it any more just, because in their world, the way the state would have acquired this land is probably also unjust, because the state also had to push out existing groups that lived there in order to acquire this in the first place. So therefore, the only way to reconcile this principle is to prove that the land will then be used effectively, and that's where we have the pragmatic debate. So to the extent that we've proven why states have worse incentives, their principle does not stand. Next response, the idea about concentration of land in the most wealthy. Note that this is contingent on the perception that the state is an inherently benevolent actor and that the state itself will effectively allocate this land. If the problem is that there is a concentration. It is far worse on their side of the house. Note the example of Venezuela, where when they had to redistribute land and the state had all control, what they did was distribute the land more to the people that supported them and take away land from the people that were their enemies. Next response, their biggest push here is that the government needs land and that there's no other mechanism of getting this. I think this is a very convenient setup, because note that in the instances where the state has legitimate reasons, no thank you, for wanting to take land, what they're able to do is justify this through eminent domain. Don't buy the lies of proposition when they tell you that this is some authoritarian thing and they're just taking land from people that need it. The way eminent domain works is that you have to justify to the public.
Point of information.
No, justify to the court what you are going to do with that land. That means the state has to justify. So in the instances where this is something that's going to have significant public utility, whether that's building an airport or building a hospital or building public housing, the state is going to be able to justify it. That's the reason that you do not get their harms of the state having to push out people in other areas in order to get this land. Okay, last few responses to them. The idea that governments have good incentives. This is because in status quo, there's accountability that allows you to regulate them. This doesn't happen on their side of the house because the citizens can no longer talk out, because there's no mechanism of comparing the state's use of land to that of private owners. This is harmful because their entire case is contingent on the very accountability that they take away. That means that all the accountability that they're concerned about does not happen on their side. Last response was this weird extension coming from second proposition about idle and unused land. Note that this still happens on their side. Just because you lease it out doesn't mean the individual is instantly going to start building something extremely productive on their side. There's no reason as to why leased land will immediately start becoming something effective, but they still haven't proven why this means that you need 100% of land. I'm pretty sure you're not going to use all the land to build schools, houses, and residences. They have to prove why that's necessary. I'm going to talk about the multiplier effect of private ownership. And note that this is important because even if proposition is able to prove that states will still have good incentives when they own 100% of the land, what they have to do is weigh this up, because on their side, you might get states with good incentives and good allocations, but you don't get any benefits, of private ownership. That is so important. I'll take a point.
If your side believes that it's detrimental for corrupt governments to just sell land off to their cronies, then isn't it worse on your side when this sale becomes permanent?
No, because there's no mechanism of correcting them. Who's going to call out the state at the point at which people are scared that the state will not give them the land that they need to build a house, that the media companies are scared that the state will take away the land that their media corporation literally stands on? The comparative is there's corruption on both sides of the house, but it gets significantly worse on your side. You have to defend that. Let's talk about the multiplier effect. We think that on our side, when there's mixed ownership of land, when the state owns everything, they become more and more ineffective, and you forego your ability to access these multiplier effects. What do these look like? It looks like the ability of corporations and individuals to use the land that they own as collateral for getting loans from the bank. This is really, really important. Let's look at how this works for companies. We think when on their side, you are far less likely to access good loans, because in status quo, note how privately owned land functions as a massive source of collateral that both companies and individuals are able to use. This is important because it means that on their side, corporations do not get the money they need to have the big infrastructure and big investments. But also, and crucially, note that the ability to access loans and use their land as collateral is what allows massive social mobility for the most vulnerable individuals in society. On their side, what you do is make the right to own land a privilege and not a right. The problem with this is that it means that individuals are at the behest of the state to make arbitrary decisions as to whether or not they should get this land in the first place. Look at the counterfactual. We think most people will therefore not have access to this land at the point at which the state is unlikely to lease it to them if they are the most economically disenfranchised. But secondly, even if they're able to get the land, this is not likely to be effective use of collateral, because a lease of 20 to 30 years isn't going to make the bank trust you and want to give you a loan. That means on their side, you do not allow individuals to be economically independent. You do not get foreign direct investment at the point at which corporations make a risk assessment and they recognize that the lease of a 20 to 30 year thing isn't worth the amount of money they're literally pouring into the country. So you're not going to get the building of infrastructure like important irrigation. You're not going to get the infrastructure of important roads and bridges and highways that states build right now, because they recognize that their corporations are going to benefit off of it in the long run. What happens on their side is you remove the incentive of states to make good contributions to and instead make them have a perverse incentive to unsustainably use this, because they know that they're going to be able to leave without having to do anything in 20 years or in 30 years. They do not care about the environmental impacts that they have, because they're not going to have to pay for it, because the land just goes back to the state and they don't have to do anything. We think that absolute power means corruption. Absolutely opposed.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 13 seconds.
May we now have the third speaker from the proposition to begin the debate?
Hi, can everyone hear me? Great, thank you. It's strange I have to do this in a Prop 3, but I want to begin by clarifying our model, because the dominant attack you heard from the previous speaker is, why 100%? We were clear in Prop 1. We needed 100% of land because we could do a few things with it. We could use some of it to create public services, like the roads, bridges, and hospitals they wanted so much. We could use some of it to have conditional leases. For example, we will lease it to your company if you build a railway or to comply with our environmental regulations. And finally, we could use part of it to lease on the free market, so that the most competitive investment would get this lease for the next 50 to 90 years. And let's be clear, we did respond to the argument on short-term leases in Gareth. We told you that many times companies need this lease to even be productive. So even if you wanted to guarantee to your electorate there's investment, you would give it a long lease. So this furious attack of why 100% really doesn't make sense. We're not saying we need 100% of any one of the things we want to do in our policy. We're saying that to make them all possible, we need 100%. Let's also be clear that this is not a policy debate. We don't have to, in quotes, push anyone out. That we were clear from Prop 1. This motion is about a world in which we own all the land. So this furious attack on our principle doesn't even make any sense. I'm going to talk about two things in this speech. First, how we improve the use of land by private actors. Second, how we improve the use of land by governments. First, how we improve the use of land by private actors. We gave you three mechanisms through which we improve the quality of investment. First, guarantee substantive on preventing speculation. I want to know that the constructive we raised in second proposition wasn't responded in the previous speaker. You didn't even hear it mentioned in that speech. It's not only strategically bad for them, it's damaging to their case, because Gareth explains to you how speculation means that land is unused. And even if it is used, the prices artificially increase so the poor don't have access. If they want
information.
Thank you. Letting people have access to land. If they want to talk about home sitting unused, they needed a response to this argument. I think third opposition is a little late. Then the second speaker says, we have no reason why land is used better. Really? We gave you two structural reasons right from Prop 1. First, we can allocate the lease to those who have the greatest ability to develop the land. Second, those who are allocated the land have greater incentive to develop it, because if not, they won't keep the lease. The only response across two speakers is this one-liner in first, that you lose potential revenue, so you want to hire people to develop that land. That's not true. Companies actually sit on raw materials all the time and natural resources because they are risk averse. They don't want to put in the necessary capital to earn more money because they are already earning enough. No, thank you. But secondly, know that many people who own this land aren't actually companies who are profit-minded. In many cases, they are just families who are rich and have been sitting on this land for generations. So the losing of the potential revenue doesn't make any sense. But more importantly, they didn't respond to our additional mechanism as how we are able to allocate the land on our side to those who have the greatest ability to develop it. These three mechanisms prove to you that we have better quality of investment to help people. They say not all countries are Singapore. First, this is weird. They brought it up. Second, this 31,000 homes again. You know why we have 31,000 homes? Because in the 1970s, our country had a population boom and a rise in homelessness because we didn't have the houses to cope with that. We are expecting the next one, and therefore we don't want homelessness ever again. I think we were pretty clear in second speaker.
Point of information.
So thank you. But yes, most countries aren't Singapore. Most countries are bigger. Most countries have unused land because people who own it have no incentive to develop it. We gave you examples like South Africa, like Zimbabwe, of people who own the land but have no incentive to do anything with it. Why were they unwilling to respond to any of these examples? Lastly, I want to highlight that they didn't bring up their free market analysis back in second speaker. Gareth rebutted it and said, no, it's not allocated by the free market. It's because they inherited the land. The fact they didn't bring it up again, probably not very important to their case. Finally, in this contention, I want to address the new constructive you heard from second opposition on how you need collateral and therefore you have the multiplier effect. First response, this social mobility argument is spurious at best. We've given you structural reasons why the poor they want to help don't own this land. So there's never going to be access to this social mobility. In fact, by their own logic of collaterals, it means the companies that own the land now are going to get even richer and therefore are going to exacerbate inequality. Second response, even if there's less investment on our side, we are willing to make the trade-off of better investment for two structural reasons. First, the majority of land in status quo isn't available for investment. Kenneth gives you structural analysis like historical factors, which means the majority of land is currently already owned and not for sale. So even if they have more investment, it's more investment on a smaller proportion of the land. Second reason, bad investment on opposition, hold on, can lead to less investment in the future because of natural resource depletion or environmental damage. So even on their metric of more investment and the multiplier effect, we ought to prioritize good investment, something we gave you 3 mechanisms for. Before we go to the second clash, I'll take that point.
So which is it? Is it not a policy debate, or are you asserting a model from third prop?
Right. It's not a policy debate. What we are saying is that states are likely to use it like this, as what we said. I think we've given you examples of how states have used this policy before, like in Singapore, like in parts of the UK, like in Bali. We've given you across 2 speakers what is likely for what our world looks like, not a policy. Secondly, do we have better provision of public services? I first want to address this argument on accountability because you didn't hear a lot of analysis from second speaker that wasn't repeated in first. The first thing they say is that governments have more accountability, less accountability because there's more land. Gareth explains that this exists on their side as well. They say they have lots of land. But moreover, they're uncomparative. Why do companies have any scrutiny? Like, who is checking on their books? Who is checking on what they're regulating other than the government that they assert is corrupt? Secondly, you have less accountability because you have nothing to compare it to. Gareth explains it's obvious if there's nepotism or a lack of open tender. Let's extend this. You can easily compare it to other countries on our side of the house. There's no reason you need to compare it to the land that's not this land that's right next to you. Finally, governments can crush dissent by not giving them land. I have 2 responses to this. First, the people who own land in status quo tend not to be dissenters. Like in most countries, I don't think MNCs are the ones who are speaking up for free speech rights. Second, oppressive governments like they characterize are going to do this either way. Like, really, guys, is the reason why Uyghurs are getting oppressed in China because the state owns their land? I don't think so. I think the land is the least of your concern when your free speech rights and your rights to protest are literally being taken away in these states. If they were so oppressive, they would take it away on either side. Let's prove the opposite. Here are 2 structural reasons why governments are better on our side because they're less beholden to lobbying. The first is that you prevent the creation of a landed gentry with the economic power to lobby. The second, more specific to land, companies can attract concessions from the government because the land is the gatekeeper to all economic activity. So that is why on our side, governments are less likely to be beholden to lobbying power. Moreover, we gave you structural analysis from first as to why governments are good actors. First, they have better incentives because they're held democratically accountable and not beholden to profit. Second, they have access to long-term economic planning as opposed to companies which are short-term. We acknowledge that governments aren't perfect, but we think they've been extremely uncomparative to the incentives of companies. Moreover, let's take them at their best and win on bad governments. Even if you ignore their analysis of how they decrease lobbying power, they will be corrupt on both sides. But on opposition, the land that a corrupt government allocates is allocated forever. On our side, if that corrupt government is ousted when the lease ends, the new government can reallocate that. That's why even after Mugabe was ousted, all the corrupt land that he allocated is still legally owned forever by his cronies. Finally, on public services, we've already addressed this why 100% concern. And moreover, they don't respond to Kenneth's 3 structural reasons why governments don't have enough land. First, land was sold in the early stages of development. Second, seizing it from the rich is infeasible because of lobbying. Third, eminent domain is expensive. Their logic on eminent domain is false because, by the way, eminent domain requires an independent valuation of your property. You can't just declare my house is worth $1, don't tax me. That doesn't make any sense. So you want it to be as high as possible for eminent domain. Moreover, Gareth explains to you why the needs are always changing, so we need land at different points of time. No response to this from second. What does this mean? It means that either they have no public services or they take land from the groups with the least political power like nature reserves or indigenous groups. This is the trade-off that we set up at first speaker that they haven't been willing to engage with. The case of the proposition has been clear. We are better for the private ownership of land because we can control which companies have the greatest ability to develop it. Second, we are able to have land for public provision. That's why perpetual land ownership perpetuates inequality and underdevelopment. We remain proud to propose.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 23 seconds.
Hello, is this audible? Can you guys all hear me? All right, cool. So I'd like to have my POIs on screen instead. Thanks. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Guys, aggressively asserting your model doesn't make up for actual analysis. This is a this house prefers a world debate. What that means is that Team Singapore cannot just come up here and say, don't look too closely at our mechanisms, guys. We're not going to prove why governments are likely to act in a good way. You just have to accept that they are. This is not the debate. The debate is about how governments are likely to act once they have total control of all the land and very little to no accountability, as we have proven to you through all 3 speeches that have been unresponded. So note, they don't have fiat. They have fiat to say that the government owns all land. They don't have fiat to say how the government will allocate that land. Crucially, what this means is that they never actually proved why the incentive structures of governments on their side is to be better once they have control over all the land. All we get is an asserted one-liner from third prop that says they're suddenly less beholden to their lobbyists. They have not proven from first and second how that was likely to happen. It was asserted at third. So no, they have 2 burdens in the debate. 1, they had to prove that 100% ownership of land created better incentives and meant that the government was better able to solve their problems. They didn't. Second, even if they proved that, they had to prove that it outweighed all the benefits of private property. Hint, they also didn't. 2 issues in this debate. First, where is government allocation of land better? Secondly, is private ownership of this land good or bad? Firstly, we accept that the problem that we told from them, that the governments in the status quo probably do need some land, and that you probably do need land in order to allocate things like public housing and all of these kinds of things. But notice that the structural reasons they give you from first about how you already sold lots of amounts to corporations and that it's expensive to use eminent domain does not mean that governments don't have access to land in the status quo. It just means that corporations have a lot. Note that what this means is that the government this does not disprove the fact that governments in the status quo have access to land. All we hear is a flippant and assertive characterization that in the status quo, lobbying means that the governments have to pay excessive prices for eminent domain. Like, this assertion does not make up for analysis of why this is likely to be true. We have already told you that in the status quo, they have democratic accountability and all of these kinds of things. What this means is that in the status quo, you can win in court, and that means that you have access to eminent domain. That means that governments still do have this kind of land. That's why in the US, 1/4 of the total land mass is state-owned. That's why in South Africa, 24% of the total land is owned by the state. That's why in India, the government owns 9 times the size of Delhi in land. That's why in Korea, they own the Korea Land and Housing Corporation. They have not been responding to all the examples we told you throughout our speeches that the governments in the vast majority of countries own large portions of land. They just don't allocate it under their side. But even in those instances, there are governments that do allocate it, and it's better. But second, notice that their only response to this is that, but you have to get the right amount of land in order to allocate. Guys, this is asserted. This is verbatim what they said in second prop. There is no analysis as to why this means that the government cannot allocate land how they want when they own a significant a portion of the land in the status quo. But second, they say that the comparative is that but this land passed through inheritance under our side of the house. The question then is which type of land passes through inheritance and which type of land goes to the cronies under their side. We told you that inheritance right now is currently owning the least valuable portions of the land. That is to say, the already unused ancestral domains and things like that, which just were not important to the vast majority of cases. But the land that they give to cronies is the valuable kind of land because the government now owns everything at that point in time. We gave you 3 structural reasons why this was likely. 1, because the government did not have to justify their actions under their side when they did not have to sue in court for eminent domain. When public accountability did not exist at the point where you cannot compare the government. And finally, that there is a coercive power in withdrawing land. They give a few responses to this. First, they say you can compare to other countries. Guys, this house prefers a world motion. It assumes that all countries will have this. That means you cannot compare to other countries. They did not read the motion. Second, they say it's less beholden to lobbying power under their side. 1, we say that this was asserted, but secondly, note that it's under their side, where it's not that they're beholden to lobbying. It's that they have an incentive to get money from the lobbyists and from the bribes and from the corruption. And there's absolutely no way to hold them accountable under their side of the house. But second, they say, but governments are long-term. No, it's electoral. You concede this. That means the government is still short-term. Third, they say that, but it's not MNC speaking up. We said, yes, sure, it's not MNCs. But no one can speak up under their side of the house because regardless of whether you're an MNC or an individual, if the government takes away your house, you're screwed. Finally, they say, but they're already not speaking up. Yes, because Singapore is very democratic. Right, this is just not true. We've told you that in the status quo, think countries like Venezuela, which took land, countries like Hong Kong, which took land, are all of these kinds of things. Second, but then they say, but there's more land use under their side of the house because you can alter land use to fix things. We've told you there is no incentive to do so. Finally, they say, but in Hong Kong, the UK government just sold it to a bunch of people, and the Hong Kong government currently has no access. Yeah, guys, do you know who that bunch of people is? It's the PRC. That's the People's Republic of China, who owns all the land in Hong Kong and leases it out and coerces everyone within Hong Kong. So in conclusion to this issue, we have clearly demonstrated that in the vast majority of cases, governments already own land. What this means is that given that they have good incentives on our side because they still have accountability, they still have all of these kinds of things, that means that we prove the problem of prop and solve it better under our side. But in instances where its government is currently not allocating land, it's unclear why this changes under their side. They have not proven why the incentives of governments change. But finally, because under prop, government allocation is worse, and the reduced accountability that comes with 100% ownership means that. In the best case for our side, our status quo is better at solving their problem. The fact that they don't solve it and in fact already make it worse means that we win. But at worst, we've proven to you that the benefits are symmetric and that both sides are able to solve to an extent. So the weighing impact then is the benefits of private ownership, assuming you don't buy the first thing. I'll take a point now.
All of the land owned by the government in the US is either native reservations or nature parks. If your model is to use this land, that just agrees to the harms we gave you in first speaker.
One, sure, you can take that away and it might be better for public housing, but this is not true in the vast majority of countries who are not the US. I've given you several other examples that you did not respond. Second issue, is private ownership of land good? They say, inheritance means they're inefficient anyway. We've proven to you that there's an incentive to sell your inheritance because the only reason why you would sit on it in the first place is because property prices rise, which means you have an incentive to sell it in the long term. Otherwise, you don't get the benefits of that property price rising. So that means that it goes to more efficient actors. This argument does not stand. But we've proven to you that it flows to the most productive actors and you get economic growth. They say in second, but there's unoccupied land. I've clearly disproven why this doesn't work, but because of the quality of land and because of the incentive to sell it. But second, they say bubbles. This is asserted. They have not proven why this was likely on their side, less likely on their side. But second, even if you get bubbles, the 2008 bubble did not outweigh the massive amounts of growth that led in the 20 to 30 years that led up to that. That is, the US's GDP was still bigger after the bubble ended in 2008 than it was in 2005 because of all the arguments that we have given you. The fact that you have more FDI on our side of the house, which they do not respond to. The fact that you have more collateral, they say, but the poor don't own land. Yes, the poor don't own land under your side of the house when that means that when the minorities have literally no access to the government. But second, because the lease is less valuable to banks and therefore they cannot leverage this lease in order to get the kinds of things that they got in the 70s and 80s. That was to say things like sending their kids to college, things like purchasing better lives, things like having better lives for themselves. But notice that there are dips in land prices that exist under our side of the house because of different things that might affect the market. So what this means is that at some point, poor people will get access, which gives them all of this social upliftment. But finally, because they don't respond to because they say you sit on raw materials. Yeah, because it's unsustainable for you to continue to exploit fracking and monocropping under their side. This was the last part of the extension we brought you from second op that they did not respond to. All of these harms under their side mean that you lose upward social mobility. That corporations have unsustainable practices, that people don't get jobs under their side, that developing countries stagnate, that there's no development of infrastructure. In conclusion, we have told you that we get better allocation of land, so we've won on their metric. But even if we didn't, the exclusive benefits of private land ownership vastly outweigh the largely co-optable benefits on their side. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Oppose.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 25 seconds.
May we now have the reply speaker from the opposition to close their case?
Am I audible? Right, cool. Panel, proposition proposition is the team that uses fiat in the place of actual mechanisms and actual structural reasoning. But note that fiat can only go so far because they actually have to prove and compare to the multiple incentives that we said about, regardless of if states are good or bad right now, that at the point at which you increase the amount of land that they have access to, the closer you get to 100%, the more likely you are to have states that have bad incentives. I'm going to give you two reasons why we win this debate. Firstly, to the extent that government land ownership is important, we've proven that the allocation of land gets worse on their side of the house. This is literally us winning by the very metric that Singapore set up for themselves. We told you two broad things in this debate. Firstly, we said that very clearly there are two reasons that states have good incentives right now. Note how this was the only response to all the analysis coming from us was for proposition to say, oh, but states are good right now. You know, they have good incentives. We were very clear. We said the reason they act good right now is because one, they have accountability because in order to get land, they have to justify it to the court and justify it to the people. Two, because they have electoral incentives. That is, they can't just unjustly acquire land right now because they want to get reelected. If they want to talk about a lack of engagement, let's talk about the analysis they just decided to ignore. We told you that the reason this doesn't happen, this happens on their side of the house, is that at the point at which you have people that are scared to call out the government for their injustices, at the point at which you have people and media corporations that are scared to hold the government accountable, you do not get the one accountability that was literally the premise of their case. Second thing we told you, we said they need to justify to this court. This is the democratic accountability that they care so much about that doesn't exist when the state doesn't have to justify to anyone. Note on their side, even if there is one-off instances, the worst case scenario of taking land from conservations right now, that you at least have to justify it. But look at what happens on their side of the house. What happens when they run out of land to take from corporations? They don't have to justify it to anyone. All they have to do is, look, we need land, we need public housing. We're going to take the land that's now a conservation that now has natural resources that we're not exploiting right now. Second thing we told you coming from our team, we said that states are ineffective and are going to just allocate this by cronyism. So if they want to talk about effective allocation, what they have to do is weigh the incentives of the state at the point at which they're accountable to no one and explain to us why the incentives of that state are always going to be good. What did we tell you? We said that the free market mechanism is probably a better comparative because it naturally allocates to the person or to the corporation that's going to have the most productive use of this. They can't just be dismissive of my first speaker's principle and say we all know economics. They actually have to engage with what it means and weigh it off. Second reason that we win this debate. Note that there are massive benefits to private land ownership. So what they had to do was even if you buy their argumentation that states and governments are going to have good incentives, they have to weigh off the mass benefits of private ownership because note on their side, you have full ownership of land by the state and no private investment, no private ownership because of the risk assessment of corporations. But secondly, that on our side, at the very least, you have a mix of that. That was our very policy. Let's talk about all the benefits that they did not respond to. The fact that you do not have FDI to the same extent, that you do not have investment, that you do not have states that are corporations that are interested in building things like proper irrigation systems or roads or highways because they know they're not going to benefit from it in the long run. That's the reason corporations build right now. If they know they're going to possibly not get their lease renewed in 20 years, why would they do these things? No response. Let's talk about the other things they didn't engage with. The fact that industries have risk assessments and that at the point at which they know that you might not renew their lease, they are less incentivized to have these investments in the state. This was very, very crucial because it led to the extension that was barely responded to. The fact that people on their side of the house are far less sustainable when they know that they don't have to be accountable to anyone. What was the analysis coming from my speech? It was that right now, at the very least, they are a little more conscious because they know if they want to sell off that land, that it has to be at least viable to some extent. This doesn't happen on their side where corporations can just abuse and have unsustainable practices and they're not held accountable for it because it just goes back to the state. We were very clear. We think that absolute power corrupts absolutely oppose.
The speaker spoke for 4 minutes and 20 seconds. May we now have the reply speaker from the proposition to close their case and close the debate proper.
Can everyone hear me? Thank you. So I had a nice reply speech planned with some nice rhetoric, but now I have to go do some housekeeping in a prop reply. Two things to clarify. One, we did not actually give our model via fiat. We gave to you reasons as to why governments will likely use this land in a credible fashion. We talked to you about democratic accountability. We talked to you about capacity building. We explained to you why the very incentives that they talk about on their side, for example, the courts don't just disappear. So it's quite clear to us that governments do have an incentive to ensure that their economies don't crash, and we think that most governments are rather sensible in this respect. The second thing that I'd like to point out is that on both sides of the House, side opposition is being constantly disingenuous with what it means to have their model. Because at some point, they're going to have to realize that they keep trying to swallow our benefits. They're going to look very close to a majority of the world looking quite a lot like having government leases. Both of these things are important because opposition has been trying to be disingenuous in this debate. Let's take a look at the two worlds that emerge at the end. And I want to show to you why the world of the opposition was a world that didn't actually have their benefits. The biggest problem that opposition's world wanted to talk about was how the big bad government in our world was going to come and take the land of poor journalists. One problem. This exists on both sides. I know they say that you need to justify eminent domain. That seems to be symmetrical at best. But also, if your government is corrupt, I'm quite sure they can come up with any justification they need to take your land. The only difference is that eminent domain is just a lot more unstable and unpredictable. And if governments are going to frequently come in and take it, then that harms their benefits on FDI as well. Especially when they concede to the fact that the ever-changing needs of a nation means that you don't and are not able to predict which bits of land you need. So if they're going to stand behind eminent domain, they need to stand behind all the harms that Kenneth talked to you about in first proposition, about how this necessarily harms their benefits to FDI, how the alternative then is nature reserves and Native American land. And if the opposition wants to be so good about taking land from the most vulnerable, then I don't think he can say in the same breath that their side's second opposition argument holds much weight. But the opposition world confuses your ability to pay for something with your ability to use it well. Like nowhere in anywhere in their logic does it say that he who knows and has the most money is the best at utilizing this land. There is no reason for this. And in opposition's world, it's quite likely that the person who gets this land is likely to be someone who's using it to turn a tidy profit for himself, but not necessarily using it for the benefit of the nation, which is the priority of a government. The last thing that they have in opposition is a world of speculation. And recognize that there was very little real response to all the other bits about how the speed at which you are required to sell this land reduces speculation. The opposition's world's only benefit is a second opposition argument. But this argument is hung on the poor being able to structurally own land. We took this out in third prop by looking at historical examples. So at the end of this debate, opposition cannot swallow our benefits. It's a bit strange that they tried to, but even then their harms were symmetrical at best, and the harms on their side were actually much worse. Let's talk about the world of the proposition. First thing to note, governments do have good incentives, and we explain these to you throughout the debate. One, there are systems of public accountability. Democratic rights don't just disappear. This is much better than in the comparative of opposition, where they create a landed gentry that is now a lot more able to lobby the government. This is much better because even if a government is bad now, that mistake can be fixed in the long run in the world of the proposition, whereas in their world, that land is gone to the crony for the rest of his life. So no, we weren't talking about fiat here. We gave you structural incentives as to why governments were able to act in this manner. We explained to you why, therefore, that in the world of the proposition, a number of benefits accrue. One, public services that individuals need, especially in nations of expanding populations and shifting demographics. This is important. Two, we incentivize better FDI. Like, look, this policy exists on the whole world. I'm not sure why any niche company would stop expanding because there's very little competition. But in proposition's world, at the very least, we ensure that if the company isn't doing what we need him to do, we can end his lease. So we're not disincentivizing investment, we're disincentivizing bad investment. For all of these reasons, we believe that perpetual land ownership perpetuates inequality. We are proud to propose.
The speaker spoke for 4 minutes and 19 seconds.
Thank you everyone for a most enjoyable debate. Can we ask everyone to wait patiently in this room as the judges deliberate? Judges will return